So, welcome to the Good Bloke Not Woke podcast, episode 7. In this session, I'm going to be talking with my old friend Grant Gamble. Now, Grant and I have known each other for over 30 years. We first met when we were both judges on the national panel for the National Aerobics Championships in Australia. And we were scheduled to be at an event, and we were asked to share a hotel room. And Grant arrived very late, and I was already in bed when he arrived. And he sort of came in, got himself set up, and he jumped into bed. And I said g'day, and he said g'day, and we ended up talking for about 3 hours. We just had so much in common and so much alignment, and we've been really dear friends ever since. And it's been a bit of a journey, and so it's so cool to have him on because he's someone who I've got incredible respect for. And this week, I thought I wanted to have a look at agreements and what happens to us when we make agreements or when we break agreements. And it's really come to a head because I've been reading about American politics, and I don't want to make this about politics, but I was just really interested about what's being said about the Speaker of the House in the US Congress, Mike Johnson, and how he's a devout Christian and a Republican, a conservative Republican, yet he's been signing off on all sorts of stuff that goes right against the grain of what he apparently believes in. And there's a lot of questions being asked. And there's questions being asked about, has he been compromised? Has he done something in his private life? And is he being compromised? And is he rolling over and agreeing with the opposition, with the Democrats to sign off on all these things that really are abhorrent to Republicans, especially conservative Christian Republicans? And so I thought, wow, it's like I've done that to myself in my life, where I've done things where I've compromised my moral code, and I've found myself in a position where I'm trying to hide something, and it's not a cool place to be. So imagine somebody in public life, if in fact he's done that, how difficult it must be. And I just felt like that would be a really cool area to explore. And Grant is somebody I really trust to sort of have those conversations with. So I wanted to sort of talk to you a little bit about Grant and tell you who he is. So he started out in the military. He was in the Navy. He was a sailor, and his resume is really impressive. So somebody who came from a background as a sailor and where he's gone in his life and what he's created is really impressive. When I first met Grant, he was operations manager and general manager of a chain of health clubs in Queensland, and he was doing great work. And I was really impressed with one of the programs he'd put in place that was a voluntary program for the staff called Eagle School, and people could come along and learn to fly with the eagles instead of hang around with the turkeys. And it was really him helping his staff to become better people. And through all that, he spoke at conferences. We both spoke at conferences, and he was invited to speak at IRSA in the US, which saw him invited to do a consulting job for a chain of health clubs in the US, and he ended up joining that group. And he worked there with them from 1997 right through to 2008. And then he went back again in 2012 and stayed with them until 2016. And basically, as senior vice president, built some of the most impressive wellness campuses I've ever seen on the East Coast of the US. Following that, he moved on to join Dr. Zach Bush, who many of you will know. And starting out with a very small team, Grant built that organization for Zach Bush, built an incredible campus, over 75 staff, and doing amazing things, and created a really profitable global venture for Zach Bush. And eventually, following the pandemic, Grant was married to an American woman, Yana, who's an extraordinary lady, 2 kids, teenagers, decided it was time to come back to Australia. And they bought a boat and sailed back, which was an incredible story within itself, because as they progressed on their trip, they realized that a lot of the ports were closed. because of COVID, and they had some very long stints in the open sea and many adventures, some of them quite frightening, and maybe we can talk about those a little bit. But since back in Australia, Grant has overseen the opening of 3 huge wellness campuses in Brisbane and is now doing some really great stuff in the AI domain, and is a real forward thinker and a creator. And along the path, he wrote an incredible book called The Affinity Principle, which is all about building great organizations by developing your teams and developing your people. So, Grant Gamble, welcome to the Good Bloke, Not Woke podcast.
Thanks, JT. Good to be here. I do object to being an old friend. I'd rather be a long-term friend, right? And I wasn't actually a sailor in the Navy. I was a junior officer. But to be honest, we're all sailors in the Navy. So, really, who's counting? But thanks for the intro. It sounds pretty impressive when you back it all up. But then when you're as old as I am, you hope you get a few runs on the board,
Isn't that one an interesting though? It's like sometimes I look back over my life and I go, damn, I've done a lot of stuff, and you realize that, you've achieved some really cool things, and you did them at the time because it felt like that was the right thing to do at the time, and you created, and then you sort of moved on to another phase, and you look back and go, wow, that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I know you've reinvented yourself a number of times, and we've met it. Our paths have crossed under so many different circumstances. It's just, it's wonderful to look back on the chapters of your life. Yeah.
Yeah, so very, very true, mate. Well, I thought I'd sort of start off this podcast and just sort of have a bit of a chat with you about some things. And firstly, I'd love to talk to you about your book, The Affinity Principle. Huge project and such a beautifully presented book. Jana's contribution to that book with her graphic design skills has been amazing. Just a beautiful book to hold in your hands, let alone read. And I just wondered about your inspiration and the pathway to writing the book and how the book's going.
That's a great question, and a big one, because so the book was really the culmination of a lot of years of working in both fitness and wellness and in other industries, and working with teams and making lots of mistakes, which is sort of the norm, and working out what worked and what didn't. And I made a lot of notes, and I had a big folder of papers and articles and notes and thoughts that I collated over many years, probably decades. And COVID hit, and we're sort of looking at each other. We're hunkered down in our house we're actually in Virginia, on the east coast of the US. And I said, maybe this is the window to do this, because I'd always thought I'd have to go to jail to write this book, because I'd never have enough time otherwise. So COVID was sort of the equivalent of that. We were stuck in this house, locked down. I was still consulting and doing some work, but it went from busy to not much. So we started working on it, but we did a weird thing. Jana designed it as I wrote it, which is not how you'd normally do it, right? Normally you'd write the book, you design it afterwards, but we were trying to fast track it to, bring it to market, and we knew we had a limited window of time. And actually, I don't think you've seen a hardcover version. This is sort of the hardcover version, but wow. It ended up being, a beautiful book, and it's got, lots of graphics. It's very like infographic-y, and lots of visuals and so forth. And Jana really added life to it, but doing it in real time was quite an exercise. And she did have to rejig it a few times, because I'd come back and tweak something and add a few words or a sentence or a paragraph. And then we went through the editing process. And so I think it was a lot of work for her, but the end result was visually stunning. In fact, she won an International Design Award for it. And we got a bestseller status with Amazon. So that was pretty surprising. But how it's going today, and answer that question, We haven't done much with it in Australia. We haven't promoted it. We haven't pushed it. The bestseller status was in the US. So we've thought about maybe doing a second edition or doing something with it. We did bring out an audio book. Mike Goldman, I don't know if you know, not Mike, but he was the voice of Big Brother, and for many years, like for a long time. And he voiced it for us, the audio book, and we released that last year, and that's got a little bit of traction. But I think somebody told me, someone very wise, and it might have been you, JT, but somebody told me that you're probably not going to make your fortune selling books. And certainly it's paid for a couple of beers here and there, but yeah, we're not going to retire on that. But it was a great work to get off my chest and literally get into print.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? It's like I decided to self-publish my book, and so I got a healthy margin on the sale of each book, but probably that limited the volume of sales for me. But I was quite happy with it. But I have an opportunity to be interviewed on television in the US about my book, and so prior to doing that, I will succumb to putting it on Amazon, and then and then it'll be volume, and there won't be much of an earn in it. But that's okay too, because at the end of the day, you write the book to help people, not as a way of creating wealth. I'm not John Grisham,
Nor am I, apparently.
Oh no, that's very cool. But really the essence of the book and your wisdom around developing staff. I mean, I know you've built some incredible teams, and I've had the benefit of actually being on site, like with ACAC, and talking to the staff and how they felt so valued working under your leadership and the opportunities for them to grow. I mean, where did you pick those skills up? I mean, where was your learning in that?
Yeah, look, obviously that began in Boy Scouts, because I was a Queen Scout. So to become a Queen Scout, you've got to do a lot of things that involve leading young men, often recalcitrant young men, on long hikes or, doing different activities, community activities and so on. So I definitely learned some skills there. As a junior officer in the Navy, leadership is what it's all about, or it's supposed to be all about. And definitely there was some hard-earned skills there. And some of those were contrast skills where you're watching people and going, okay, I don't want to do things that way. And beyond that, my first club that I owned, I fell into. I literally fell into it. And I didn't know what I didn't know. And I had a team, and that club had actually gone bust 4 times at that site when I took it over. And I had a team there of really good people, but they'd never really been acknowledged before. They'd never been truly engaged. And I used some of the skills I'd learned, to do that. And it wasn't even, I don't think I really was thinking logically about it. I was just doing what was coming intuitively at that point. And also just the old adage, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. I was treating them the way I would want to be treated, because I'd grown up in the fitness industry, from a aerobics instructor to trainer to front desk person to assistant general manager, then to a general manager. I'd sort of been through the works. And when I was cleaning the club, and where I started out in a full-time role, cleaning the club and working at the front desk, I probably wasn't treated the way I'd like to have been treated. So good lessons in that. But when I got to scale that up into chains and into larger groups, the challenge then is, how do you scale that? Because I can't be at every site. I can't, do that. And I really need to grow the people. And that's where Eagle School, or I later called Eagle Academy, came from. It was just focused on how do we grow our people? How do we help our people be the best that they can be? And in turn, what happens is they influence the very fabric of the organization. And it's funny because I ran Eagle Academy at every location that I was at. But at one of those locations, I won't name them, as soon as I left, they changed Eagle Academy to skills to use spreadsheets or to get better at your job. and it floundered, and their numbers shifted too. So instead of these team members being really engaged and on point, it suddenly became all about the job, and that shifted. So I think the essence of the affinity principle, which is what you're referencing here, is that it is all about people first always, which is sort of the mantra.
Yeah.
And when we help people be the best that they can be, the organization flourishes. Yeah, and just one thing that I haven't, I think, told you yet, but I came across recently some articles about a thing called the service profit chain. And the service profit chain was written about back in the late 90s, unbeknownst to me. And it sort of is part of my affinity principle. And what it has shown, and they've shown this through significant research, that if the team members are engaged and they're really enjoying their work and they're in flow, then your members or customers are going to, in turn, be enjoying the experience. It's almost inevitable. And that equals financial results. So the affinity principle is exactly that, except I add in the leadership piece, because I really think it starts with a leader, whether the team's engaged or not, whether the team feels valued or not, whether they are in flow is all going to be a function of leadership. So I think to the service profit chain, there's proof that if the team is engaged, that's going to impact your numbers ultimately. And I would argue that it's going to start with the leader. And last point I'd make is just that scaling thing. The challenge I faced was, how do I, get this out? And training the team was the logical way, training the managers and the leaders, but even the team on the ground, to imbibe this sense of ownership, of affinity for the organization, but affinity for the members or the team, all the customers. But equally, as things got bigger and they got to a certain scale where I couldn't do that one-on-one or even in groups or even, across the board, that's sort of where the book came from. And ultimately our AI system as well. That was sort of the extension of the book to go, okay, how do we automate this? And, rest is history. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah,
Sorry,
amazing.
long-winded
What a
answer.
journey, eh?
Yeah.
What a journey.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because some of what I wanted to sort of talk with you about today, as you know, this podcast, the whole premise of this podcast is about discovering healthy masculinity, and that's a journey. It's a pathway in life, and I feel like I'm still getting better at it. And I describe healthy masculinity as the development of a strong and robust moral compass, and then having the courage to live by that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so part of it, leading back to my intro, is about agreements and creating agreements and keeping agreements. And there's all sorts of agreements. There's agreements we make with our intimate partners, whether that be a wedding ceremony where we exchange vows, or whether we in a non-wed situation where we make agreements, or agreements can be in the workplace, agreements can be with our kids, agreements can be with our community, whatever. There's agreements. And some of the things that drag people away from or put people in positions where they might contemplate compromising an agreement, or they actually break an agreement. And one of them, of course, you and I have got a long background in the fitness industry, and it's an industry where it's all about the body. There's a lot of sexualization, and there's a lot of, I suppose, temptation. And some people, men and women, they navigate that beautifully and they never bend to it. And some of them fall into it and they make mistakes, and they perhaps breach agreements with their partners and do things they shouldn't do, or they actually become the architects of broken agreements, whereas they get into the seduction and they start messing around. And we've seen all of it in the industry, and you've met a lot of people. And number one, how did you navigate that? And what do you feel is going on for the people who do succumb to that and end up, putting themselves in very compromising situations?
Yeah, well, I'd like to say I never crossed that line, but that wouldn't be true. There's definitely been incidents in my history where I've made mistakes or crossed a line that maybe I didn't even realize was there, or or maybe that you, pretend's not there.
Yeah. Me too, by the way.
Yeah, look, I'm human,
Yeah.
and I try not to live with regrets, but there's definitely stuff where I go, geez, I would do that differently today.
Yeah.
I learned some hard lessons certainly early in the piece, and some of those lessons stayed with me. Some of those evolved, but ultimately, what I'd say, I really got to a point of realizing that you got to look at yourself in the mirror in the morning.
Mm.
And regardless of whether you're in a relationship or not in a relationship, there's an agreement that you have with yourself, be that spoken or unspoken, where you commit to be ideally the best that you can be. And I really, it became very easy for me to see the value of that short-term exchange, or that, pushing up to the line or pushing over the line, how much that would impact your own ability to look at yourself in the morning and going, I'm good, I'm whole, I am, I feel worthy. Because a lot of us want to be more, we want to have more, we want to do more, we want to see more, we want to be more. You have to feel worthy in order to even accept that oftentimes. And I feel like that worth comes from within. It's not just what you consciously acknowledge, it's also what you intrinsically have taken on. Or I think you mentioned at some point in our lead up to this, karma, and I really believe in that. I really believe that the seed you sow, so you shall reap. And so, to my advice for people in the industry, my advice for people that are coming up against this, is to firstly be very present in the moment. Like, that's sort of where it starts. This is all we've got, right? This very moment. And in being present, a lot of times we think we're actually there, right? But we're really unconscious. We're in our mode of doing stuff that we've done before, or doing what feels good at the time, but we know is going to have repercussions, but we roll over it. And when you're really present and mindful, those incidents disappear. That's what I've found. And so that would be my advice. One of my, sort of tags on the book is mindful leadership. There's been a lot of incidents where I don't think I've been mindful and I haven't been really present for my team, and that has the same potent, because if you're not really engaged and you're not present, it's hard to navigate things. So I think my advice to people is, firstly, think with the end in mind, like Covey would say, what would be the end in mind? And the end in mind being, ideally, you want to be the best person you can be. Well, is what I'm doing at this present moment leading to that? Is it adding to that, or is it taking away? Because, rarely is an exchange neutral. Usually it's adding to something, or it's taking away.
Yeah.
So yeah, presence. I think presence would be the key word I'd put on that.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, my probably thing that I had to work through and deal with is I can be incredibly flirtatious, and I used to always convince myself that that's just innocent fun, but the reality is that's such a breach of an agreement with my partners at the time. I mean, I've been married a couple of times, and I've broken agreements with my partners. It's I mean, I cheated on my second wife, and that was what brought my marriage to an end, and that was a brutal lesson, and but it wasn't a single dimension lesson. There was so many lessons to it about what had been sitting in for a long time and wasn't being honest with myself about how I was feeling, and then leading to me doing things that I had justifications for. And all of that was just me deceiving myself, and it ends up in a really mucky place. But what I realized is that as soon as I stepped out across those lines, whether it be just flirtatious connections or that little game playing, I couldn't then be fully present with my partner
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
know what I've been doing.
Yep.
And so I'm keeping it a secret, you know. And so it's causing separation
Yeah.
already, you know, and you can't get rid of that separation until you get honest, you know, and
Yep.
reveal what you've done and clean it up and
Yep.
recommit to the agreement. And I'm just wondering how often that happens in workplaces, you know, where we've got this really clear agreement and then we do something that we've got a justification for, but it creates separation with a teammate or a boss or somebody underneath us or whatever. And then all of a sudden the agreement has actually been compromised and it drives a wedge into the situation.
I see this in companies, JT, you know, to accentuate that point, where leaders are making decisions that they argue, and this is a different framework, but similar thing, that they argue is for the good of the company, right? And for the shareholders and the investors and so on. But they're compromising team members and even the customer in that exchange. And you see how that impacts, you know, the framework in the energy within that business. And we measure it with our AI system. We actually measure in team engagement. We measure, you know, the member or customer experience, and you can see it. Like, you can see it track behind the leadership's input. And this is not, you know, about karma or even measuring energy. It's measuring simply what's the downstream impact of the decisions you make. And, you know, Eleanor Roosevelt has a great quote, and the quote is, you might win the rat race, but you're still a rat, right? And I'm like, I love that, right? Because I see so many, you know, companies justify their actions in defense of the shareholders' stake or the investors' stake, but what they're doing is compromising significantly, and they do compromise the long-term integrity and functionality of that company. They end up with high turnover that adds to their costs. I mean, the thought is that short-term decision is worth it, much like we're talking about, but the long-term repercussions, downstream repercussions, often cost far more. So it's exactly that.
It is, I mean, it's such a muddy game, isn't it? And it's but there's so many opportunities, as you talked about before, about getting some brutal lessons. I mean, the lessons, I'm so glad for my lessons because they were my greatest teachers. But there have been many times in the past where I tried to deny the lessons and justify or, you know, explain away or blame. Blame's a really good one, right? And but there's no growth in that area. But it's so interesting that you bring that one up because I agree with you. I've watched a couple of different companies I've been closely associated with that were brilliant companies, brilliant culture. The employees loved working there and they had stability, low turnover, and then they float on the stock exchange and the wheels fall off, you know? And it took me to a conversation I had, and you'd appreciate this, and I'd be interested in your comments. I was having dinner with some friends during the time of the banking inquiry. Now, I'm not sure whether you were back in Australia then, but you know, there was a massive banking inquiry, and the banks were exposed for doing some shitty stuff, you know, putting fees on all sorts of things, and the people at the table were really getting into it and really sort of chomping down on the banks for how evil they were and that sort of thing. And I just had this sort of little insight, and I started asking questions, and I was having a bit of fun really. And I asked how many of them had superannuation. Of course, they all did. And I asked how they felt their superannuation was performing. And one person said that theirs was okay, but the rest were dissatisfied with their superannuation. And I said, what do you do when your super's not performing? And a couple of them said, well, I get on the phone and I chew them out, you know. And I said, so how does your superannuation fund make money? And they said, well, investments. And I said, what sort of investments? And we got down to the fact that a big part of it is the stock market. And I said, what sort of stocks do they invest in? Of course, it's blue ribbon stocks. And what are the blue ribbon stocks? And of course, we got down to the fact that the banks are the blue ribbon stocks. And I said, so you're the one who's actually putting the pressure on the banks to make more profit. so,
Yeah.
so actually you're the one that's creating the pressure that leads to the banks doing stuff that's dishonest, which is stealing money out of your account, right? And it's like, and they got to see how actually they're not victims of the whole thing. They're part of the whole charade, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's a really interesting thing about, you know, what advantages are we trying to take from the system as opposed to what we're contributing?
Downstream impact, and you know, there's a big cry for sustainability right now, and you know, there's a lot of different things that people are pushing for, and I think the question that people need to ask themselves, which is exactly what you're asking, is what are you really willing to give up? What are you really willing to compromise or to accept as part of that equation? Because we're all part of that equation. Whatever happens, we're all part of the ultimate outcome. And oftentimes people say, well, I'm just a cog in the wheel and I'm just one little part. And yeah, that's true. But your actions, it's a butterfly effect. You know, your actions have long-term consequences, and the decisions that we make every day, you know, to speak to your moral compass point, you know, if we have a strong moral compass and it's well defined and we're present, you know, enough to really know if we're on course, then probably should have a reasonably clear conscience. But to your point as well, a lot of times we don't realize the downstream effect of what we're doing. So it's complex. You know, life's messy, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it's so interesting and perhaps that's part of the challenge is we don't take enough time to contemplate, you know, and really sort of explore where we're headed and what we're doing. And you know, I spent a few years as a single man, so I had lots of time alone to contemplate these things, and I found it really, really fascinating to explore, you know, what's really going on the planet and where am I playing a role in it. I suppose the next thing I want to sort of ask you about, because this is, you've been involved at senior management level in some decent sized corporations where you employ a lot of staff. And, you know, we make agreements. And I might have mentioned this on the podcast once before, but I actually went on a date with a woman, and you know, I realized almost immediately that she wasn't really someone I'd be very interested in, but I'd made an agreement to meet her for a cup of coffee for an hour. So I decided to really enjoy that conversation. And, you know, the first thing that happened was she wanted to know about my relationship history. And it felt like a bit like an interrogation, but I just shared everything with her, and no, I've got no reason to not be truthful, you know, and I gave her the whole lot. And it sort of went quiet in the conversation after that. And I thought, well, maybe she wants me to ask her. So I asked her about hers, and she said, I was married for 25 years. And I said, wow, that's good effort. 25 years is a good marriage. And I said, what happened? She said, he cheated on me. And I said, oh, that's not good. And I said, how do you get on with him now? And she said, I can't even be in the same room with him. He disgusts me. I said, oh, how long ago was that? And she said, 8 years. I said, wow, 8 years and you still feel that way? And she said, I do. I cannot stand him, you know? And I just got this little sort of intuitive hit. And I just said to her, what were your marriage vows? And she said, well, how am I meant to remember those? It was 33 years ago. And I said, yeah, I get it. That's a long time. I said, but I could also say that, you know, marriage vows for most of us, that's the perhaps the only time we've ever stood up and declared something public that we're going to do. So I could say, I'm surprised you don't remember. And she said, well, I don't. I said, well, obviously one of your husband's vows had something to do with fidelity. And she said, yes, it did. And I said, so he made a solemn agreement with you at the altar, but then he broke that agreement later on. And she said, yes, that's what happened. And I said, well, how do you know you didn't break one of your agreements first? And she went, oh, I don't. I said, okay. And I just left it at that. Anyway, about 3 days later, she texted me and said, and the text said, have you got a minute to talk? So I rang her and she said, you won't believe it. I found my marriage vows. And I burst out laughing. I said, really? You went looking for them? She said, how could I not? You know, I said, what did you find? She said, you're not going to believe this. She said, one of my vows was to love and honor my husband. And she said, you know what? I was a fucking cow. She said, I broke my agreement with him long before he broke his with me. And I just went, wow, how amazing is that? And she
Yeah.
said, I
Yeah.
know.
Wow.
She goes, I know. I can't believe it. And I said, how do you feel about him now? And she said, I have nothing but compassion for him.
Wow.
And I said, wow, that,
Perspective. Yeah.
yeah. I said, what a relief for your kids. And
Yeah.
she said, oh, tell me about it, you know. But I think
How much
about,
did she should have paid you for that counseling session, by the way. That's like, yeah, that's brilliant.
exactly, but it's so cool. But you know,
To her credit.
I give credit to the training that I've had to actually listen when I feel something, you know, and I've
Yeah.
had very good training, as you know, through my work in
Yeah.
the Avatar course. But then I come to the workplace, you know, and when a person signs on for a job, they get given a job description and they agree on a salary. So that's an agreement, right?
Yeah.
And so what happens when people feel like, you know, they're being asked to do more than what was in the job description, and they
Yeah.
sort of roll over and they do it because they want to please their boss or they want to be approved of, but at some level they've got a bit of resentment. What do you feel it is that stops either the employer or the employee from stopping and saying, hang on a minute, we need to talk about our agreement? Because people feel it, you know, and we're talking here about having a strong moral code and having the courage to live by it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it feels like people will recognize that something's gone off the rails a little bit, but
Yeah.
what stops them having the courage to put their hand up and go, hey, can we have a conversation?
JT, this is a really salient point, and I think most organizations struggle with this. And I want to speak to it because it's actually very much front of mind for me. Because when I go to a company that we're implementing our AI system, I actually look at their core values. I actually look at their vision statement, their mission statement, their philosophy. And I did a training this morning with a company locally here in Brisbane, and I went to their philosophy, core values, vision, and there's so much alignment with that company and how they act and those things that what you see in that company is high retention and a higher level of engagement of team members. And why they are excited about having this system is not just to acknowledge that, but our system will actually highlight any discrepancies that are there because they want to see those discrepancies. I'll give you a counter example. One of our longest serving clients is kind of the contrast to that. And I don't know if you remember back in the fitness days, but they use contrast correction to demonstrate how not to do an exercise, right? Well, you know, this client would be an example of that. And my point there is, if you go to their values and you go to their mission statement and you look at those things, there's a complete misalignment with actually how they act. And so they're constantly breaking their agreements with their team members. And as a function of that, their team members are disengaged. They have a very high attrition rate. And the outcome is, you know, contrary to what they want. But talking about marriages, I'm just going to jump back to something. You remember my first wife, Susie, and Susie and I get on great. We're great friends, but we broke up, and because she broke an agreement to me. Now, what you got me thinking though is what agreements did I break to her, you know, in advance of that
Yeah,
to her?
amazing, isn't it?
Great question, great question. But regardless, I don't feel any bitterness towards Susie, and yeah, she broke an agreement, and you know, therefore, for whatever reasons, we terminated. But my point there is, what I learned in that experience, the sad part about it was, don't listen to what someone says, look at what they do, right? And that's my point about this company. It really doesn't matter, or all companies, doesn't matter what your values are, what your mission is, what your philosophy is, if you don't live to it, right? It's just a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And I think that that line's crossed routinely. You described it so well. These, and I'm going to say these companies that don't hold to their core values, because I've got to say, I've really not come across a company without a great set of core values, mission, value. If they stuck to it, it would be a Patagonia, right? It would be sort of in that sort of league. There's some really overarching goals among those statements, but the number of companies that actually truly live to it are very few.
Yeah.
Now, I was working with a company yesterday, or had a call with a company yesterday, and that company, interestingly, has a great set of core values, great mission, great vision, and they want to live to it.
Yeah.
They know they're not, but they want to live to it. There's a difference there, right? It's actually being aware that, okay, we're not there, but we want to get to that. And that's why they want our system, is to help them elucidate that, or to illuminate that. That's a very different situation, right? But the companies that choose to, call it the ostrich syndrome, put their head in the sand and just plow ahead, and, whatever drives money to the bottom line, is good. What they don't realize is what they're leaving on the table. And I've demonstrated this in companies I've come into to turn around, where struggling financially, and it's like scrappy, and they're cutting corners and they're ripping people off, and I say that's a harsh statement, but they're really not doing what they're presenting that they're going to do. And when you come in and I don't want to sound like all sanctimonious by saying put integrity back, just put these things back in perspective. And this happened with a company I was running, where I looked at their core values and their vision and their mission. I'm like, this is really good, right? But when we asked the question of the team, are you aware of our purpose and our core values and our mission? And the answer was no, right? And the answer is because it's not threaded throughout the company. And we just did simple things like, putting the core values up everywhere you could look. So at the photocopier, in the restrooms, on the job descriptions, in the position descriptions, and really putting it out there, because what we were really doing was making an overt agreement as a company. This is what we're going to live to. And it became so much more transparent when you didn't. And it changed the fabric of that company very quickly. In fact, within months, on the dashboard we have, right, it's got a needle, right? And the needle was sitting maybe a little bit past center, and it just bounced almost, not all the way, but it bounced into the positive really quickly. It's amazing how quickly change can take place, but it truly requires that presence to see, okay, this is missing and we need to put it in, and the diligence to do it. But it's not rocket science. It's not that, pardon my French, it's not that bloody hard.
No.
But a lot of companies make it hard for themselves. They one last soundbite. As a consultant, I used to come in and resurrect companies. That's sort of what I did. That was my calling card. I'd come in and pick a company up and dust it off and get it rolling. And if ever I heard anybody, I'd ask questions, for example, like, so why do we do that? Why do we do it that way? And that answer, the answer that's coming, right? Because that's how we've always done it. I mean, I'm just like, I just want to tear my hair out. I just want to shake them. I'm like, that's not an answer. That's like a parent saying, when a kid asks why and you go because, that's not an answer, right? So I would come to these companies and they'd be doing stuff, and I'm like, this is literally crazy what you're doing, but it had been infiltrated or inculcated into the company over years. And they didn't even know why they were doing it in the end. And they were just like literally stabbing themselves in the foot and trying to run a marathon,
Yeah.
Anyway.
So incredible, isn't it? But it comes back to your thing about being aware and taking a moment to be in the present, really take stock of what's really happening. And I suppose that's not just what's happening around you, but what's happening in yourself, and being honest with yourself in that moment, And I think that, part of what I was talking about before about being flirtatious, the intention I realized I was sitting in was that I was using that to sort of gain some sort of higher level of acceptance of who I am as a likable person, and almost competing with other men. It's sort of like that stupid game that you play in your late teens and early 20s. And, I was still playing it when I was much older than that. And I'm realizing that that's where I was, and that there's no need to be that anymore. You can step into a new area of life. But, when you roll into continuing to behave that way, it's like the company, why are you doing it this way? Well, because, it's sort of like this snowball rolling down the hill,
Yeah.
and whilst it's gaining momentum, it's also melting, right?
Yes.
And
Yes. Yeah.
but it's like this whole area of agreements. I mean, like I've got agreements that I know I've broken in my life, and I'm still working to repair those. I think, there's so many things. I mean, even stuff that I committed to my mum and dad who have been gone for a long time. It's like, have I really fulfilled those things? And what else have I got to do to fulfill that? Or commitments I've made with others, my siblings, or I think it's a constant journey and we can probably never be perfect, but we can continue to try to grow and to evolve. And I think that, through all my contemplation in this, Grant, I got to the point I thought, why is it that when I was at school, we didn't have a subject that probably went for many lessons where we explored and learned about and sought to understand what it meant to make an agreement?
Yeah. I think that the subject's life skills, and that's one of the subsets of that, isn't it? It's a great question. I look at what happens in the school system. I just got to say, I feel like our education system's pretty messed up. I feel like the medical system, our healthcare system's pretty messed up. Our political system's pretty messed up. If you go through all the bureaucracies within our, the foundation stones really of our society, they're all pretty messy. They're examples of, you have the committee they're supposed to design a horse and they end up with a camel. And I think there's a whole bunch of camels we're riding around on, right? And to your point, about this, in the school system, we should be preparing young people for life. And life isn't, and I realize that some people need algebra and some people need some of these esoteric things, right? But at the end of the day, life is about managing yourself and managing your actions. And what you're talking about, the subject of agreements, is a great example of that. Managing your agreements that you make with yourself, you make with others, overt or not. I think, goodness me, look, I've thought often about, how could you inject into the system, I'm talking the education system, a life skills program, right? A real life skills program. And I know there's been attempts made at that, and there are things out there, and they teach you how to balance your checkbook, or, they teach you how to, manage, basic things. But I think it's truly those more intangible things that are far more powerful and far more impactful, because if kids did learn how to appreciate the significance of an agreement and the impact of breaking that agreement or maintaining that agreement, powerful stuff. Can you think of the path that a lot of kids would follow then versus the path they're on, without really having even any awareness around that, or the potential impact of it? Because most of our actions, it's like with karma, most of our actions don't directly come back at us necessarily, but they always come back and bite us. There's no question about that. I love it. I don't know, look, I'm not a doomsdayer. I don't think the world's going to collapse around our ears or anything like that. But I do feel like there's a need for systemic change in almost every system that's in place. And the healthcare system's the classic one for me, because I've worked in it a lot, with integrating with healthcare. I call it the sick care system, right?
Yeah.
Because what is it? It's like, it's dealing with people when they're sick and band-aiding it. And I'm not criticizing doctors and nurses and specialists and the amazing and talented people out there that have studied long and hard and do tremendous work. I'm just saying the system in and of itself is fundamentally broken. And there's agreements that physicians make, for example, with themselves and under the Hippocratic Oath, like where they're saying, I will, do no harm. And yet inherently, a lot of prescriptions get written do a lot of harm, right? A lot of things that come out of the system, but the system's built to drive dollars, not built literally to drive health. Again, I call it the sick care system because it's truly not the healthcare system.
Yeah.
The average doc, not to go on a little rant, but I'm going to anyway. Average doc in the States does 1 or 2 lectures on fitness and nutrition in the extent of all their studies, right? Now, the number of programs and courses and lectures that they get on pharmaceuticals and on prescription of, things to band-aid or patch up the problem, immense, right? But there's no focus on preventative health. And therein would lie a systemic improvement to that system would be to say, let's focus on preventive health with people rather than patching them up when everything's broken. And I think what you're describing, back to your point about the education system, I think if the education system is truly designed to help people function in the world, they need, again, to have that upheaval and injecting, that subject, even if it was just a subject of agreements, there'd be a significant shift in the output, of the kids that are coming out of these programs, just in and of that itself. I will add one thing, sorry, but I'm getting to rant a little bit, sorry, but social media, right? I think social media has got a lot to pay for, like it's got a lot to answer for. And, teen suicide in the States has gone up about over 130% since, the advent of, and that's teen girls, of social media. And, causation, correlation, you can make arguments and people do, but there's no doubt that a lot of what's happening and what kids are signing up for and what parents are signing kids up for, right? By giving them a phone and by putting them on social media or allowing them to be on social media, we're making agreements. And I'm going to say with the devil on some levels, in that we're putting tools in the hands of these young children that do not set them up for success. And I think, in the realm of agreements, I'd say we should be teaching kids about that, absolutely. But we also should be encouraging parents to make solid agreements with themselves and with their kids to give them the best shot at things. Some states, I think Florida has implemented a 16-year, barrier for social media. You can't be on social media if you're under 16. Look, I love that conceptually. I'm always in favor of freedom of speech and freedom, of people's will. But man, at some point we've got to start putting, and I think this is what you're talking to, putting some guidelines in for people, which really is what's an agreement is a little more than that. It's a little more like we are going to stick to this, but within that, just to give people frameworks to work within, because I'm seeing today more people struggling with mental health and overwhelm and stress, and it's just endemic. And the other group that the suicide rate has gone up in significantly is what? It's older males, older white males. The suicide rate has just gone crazy. There's so much happening out there that is a function of on some degree, in some ways, over-regulation, in some ways, under-regulation. But I'd say take the regulations out of it and just go back to your moral compass, go back to common sense, go back to where we should be coming from. And I think the essence of it should be to do no harm, to help people be the best that they can be and to give them the tools to do that. And when you're asking a kid, for example, to make decisions before their frontal cortex, like before they're really, I'm going to call them fully sentient, right? It's fully cognizant. Man, we've got to it starts with the parents. I'm sorry. I've gone round and round in circles there. Sorry, but I just think that the parents
Get it.
is where it starts.
I think that it's really interesting. You raised a few different points there, and one, the medical system, as you know, back in the late 90s, I lectured in medicine. I taught wellness in the School of Medicine at Monash University,
Yep.
and the opposition to my subject from other lecturers was extraordinary. They eventually got it killed off because they
Yep.
didn't think it was real medicine. And basically now in the medical schools in Australia, the students come in, they do 2 years of intense sciences, physiology, anatomy, biochemistry, etc. And then for the rest of their course, when they're not doing hospital rounds, they're learning how to match pharmaceuticals up with symptoms. And
Yep.
as one of my great mentors, Professor Avni Sali, who was the founder of the National Institute of Integrative Medicine, he said basically what the medical schools are doing is they're churning out highly credentialed pharmaceutical sales reps.
Yes.
They're not
Yes.
doctors,
Yes.
and I don't wish to insult them, but that's how much the system's been railroaded by big pharma. Now, I'm all for a capitalist economy. I love a market economy,
Yep.
but even when I was at school studying economics as a 16-year-old, it was made very clear to us what happens when monopolies manifest. And, our governments, for whatever reason, haven't got the courage to smash those monopolies. And what we saw during the pandemic was doctors breaching their own oath and following through with vaccine mandates when they knew that there wasn't safety data and they weren't sure. But there was a number of incredible doctors who put their hand up and said, no, I'm not doing it. They're the ones who have the moral compass, and they're the ones who are taking a lot of leadership. But I wonder if in all of this, where the men are in society, right? Because, as a man, I'm the guardian of my family. And I know I had a couple of incidents when my son was at school, especially at primary school, with one principal. And the first time was when Eminem became really big, back in the early 2000s. And this principal sent a letter home saying to parents, you should be more observant of the music the children are listening to, and you should be ensuring that they aren't listening to music that should be damaging to them. I went, wow. And I went up to the school and saw him, and I sat down and said, man, you're older than me. Surely you were around when the Beatles and the Rolling Stones came to prominence. What were the school principals telling parents back then,
Yeah.
And I said, and did you agree with it? I said, well, you just did the same thing. I said, stop being an idiot. You can support parents with, and so what I did is my son wanted the Eminem CD. So I went with him, we bought it, and we sat down and we listened to it together.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to me at the end, what do you think of it, Dad? And I said, can we listen to it again? I really like it, But it was like, and, as you know, when you're a kid, as a parent, if you give a kid a gun, you're going to hang around with them for a long time to make sure they're learning how to use it responsibly.
Yeah.
Well, I reckon giving
Absolutely.
a kid a smartphone is the same. If I'm a dad and I'm giving my kid a smartphone, I need to hang around with him or her until they know how to use it responsibly. And I need to be there to mentor them, to watch them, to guide them, to help them with that. And it's lazy parenting to just throw them the smartphone and think you're being, Santa Claus, because you're not. But I had another situation at the same school where on the weekend, my son and his mates were up at the school, and there was this old glass house sitting over in the corner. It wasn't very big, and it was rusted, and a lot of the glass was broken. And so they were throwing stones at it, breaking the glass, right? And anyway, something came up. The principal heard about it, and he issued this decree that boys were being vandals on the school grounds, and they're in big trouble, etc., etc. And my son came to me and goes, oh, Dad, that was me, I said, well, what do you want to do about it? And he was really scared. And I said, well, do you want to go up and own up? And he said, oh, I think I need to, Dad. So we went up to the school together, and we went to the principal's office, and he sat there in the principal's office, And he said, I was one of the ones who was smashing the glass. So he's got a moral compass, you know. And you know what the principal did? He said, well, I'm sitting here wondering whether I should call the police. And he bullied and intimidated and frightened my son, you know.
Yep.
And in the end, we left, and I took my son home and we had a chat about it. Then I went back and I sat down with the principal. I said, how dare you? How dare you? He had the courage to come up and own up and take responsibility for what he'd done. And you bullied him and you frightened him. And that was so unnecessary. And I said, if I ever catch you doing that again, you're going to have to deal with me, mate, because you don't do that to my son. And I'm wondering how many fathers are actually feeling stuff around the schooling of their kids and they're not saying anything. You know, what would happen if they went up to the school and just said, you're not doing that?
Yeah. Yeah. We had a similar situation with Stella, and she was at school, and she'd been bullied out of a school, ended up in a second school, and the bully from the previous school infiltrated that school. and we, in both cases, went and, you know, ponied up with the principal and were very clear on what was fair and what was reasonable and how it was, you know, not being dealt with. And we extracted her from the first school and we ended up doing the same from the second. You know, the problem with the system, though, is that there's an immense amount of pressure on these principals to, I don't know how the best way to say this is, you know, they need a total line and to, you know, maintain the party line. And oftentimes they're in conflict, you know. Also, might I say, oftentimes they don't have the innate skills to really pass the nuances within these situations. And most times, and I'm just going to generalize here, they also don't have the cojones, right, to go and do what's right and push against the system. You know, it's tough. But to your point, JT, in terms of parenting, you know I've been absent through work and through travel and various things where I haven't been fully present with my kids, and I've regretted the impact that's had. And there's a price you pay. And you know, and I heard a great quote the other day on a podcast, and it was, you know, a psychologist, and he was essentially saying, look, if you're a winner, like winners do give up, right? I'm like, oh, okay. And he's like, yeah, winners give up because they give up a lot of things to be a winner. You know, you sort of have to focus, right? You've got to be monochromatic with, you know, if you want to be the best tennis player ever, you can't have all these other facets of your life. It's got to be like this. And I felt like that was, you know, a really, really powerful point. And my point as it relates to that is there's compromise. You know, there is compromise at so many different points. And we need to decide what are we going to give up, right? In order to be the best parent we can be or the best executive we can be. You know, it's never going to be perfect. But we've also got to look at the long-term repercussions, and what we do with our kids has long-term repercussions. And you mentioned, you know, our sailing trip, that began in an RV. So we were in COVID. We were with our kids 24/7. They were doing what they normally did, and I was like literally mortified with where the kids were at. And some of that was a byproduct of COVID and the lockdown and all that, but some of it was just a byproduct of that's who they had grown into. And I just was not around enough, right, to really, really see it. And it was a wake-up call for me and for Yana. And one day we're out paddling on the reservoir, and she said, you know, I think we should sell the house, get an RV and hit the road. And I'm like, absolutely. Like I barely even had to hesitate, because I'm like, we've got to change something, right? Because this is not good where the kids are at, not good where we're at, not good where the whole thing's at. And so we did. We literally turned our life upside down, and that began a 13-month journey where we jumped in, we sold the house, bought an RV, and we traveled for 8 months with the kids. And what happened in those first 2 months, JT, was amazing, truly amazing. What happened was we saw a change in them before our eyes because we were truly present with them. You see, there's nowhere to hide in an RV. There was 4 of us plus 3 dogs, right? So we're like literally jam-packed in, right? It was a big RV, but still. And when I was doing the trash, or someone was washing up, or someone was doing this or that, you couldn't hide. You couldn't be in your room. You couldn't be in the basement. You couldn't be in the cottage at the back of the property. You couldn't be, you were there. And it really brought home to them, particularly, just what it meant to be part of a family, to be part of a community, like to contribute. And I've got to say, we watched them change over a couple of months. And then when we migrated from the bus onto the boat, that was a huge step up again of responsibility because we had shifts. You had watches, and, everything had to get shared. There was 4 of us on the boat, and we're sailing 24/7 because when you're sailing, you can't pull over to the side of the road or pull into the next RV park. When you're 1,000 miles out at sea in 7 kilometers of water deep, you probably need to pay attention, right? So my point is, we got a really good lesson in parenting, which was the contrast of where we'd ended up. Even though we felt like our kids were doing great and were generally healthy and well, we realized how many of the decisions we'd made, and particularly me, in what I gave up, the things that I gave up in order to be this or to be that. And when we literally gave up everything, my wife wrote a book. I'll just grab it. Called Coach Culture Nomads, right? And this book, it's got 1,700 photos. It's got QR codes. I mean, it's just an amazing book about our journey. But what it underlines in that book, in all those pages, it just underlines those lessons, those hard-earned lessons about compromise and what you have to give up in order to, to achieve things sometimes. But to your point, to absolutely close out your point, is that if you're present and you're really engaged, it actually is simple. It actually will come out the way you want it to come out. But that's hard. That's also hard to be able to commit to that level of mindfulness around your kids and around what you do.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? And 45 odd years ago, Malcolm Fraser got laughed out of town saying because he said life wasn't meant to be easy.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
but it's true, and what I guess you're talking about there is making new agreements with yourself and with your kids and
Absolutely.
your partner,
Absolutely.
and then following through and honoring those, and that can be so difficult sometimes, and because circumstances change, and it's a bit like with you, when you're sailing across there between Bora Bora and Fiji, 14 days at sea, sometimes the conditions changed, but you had to stick with your plan to get to Fiji, right?
Yep. You adjust the sails, and there's stuff you do, right? But at the end of the day, you still got to commit to that. And you're exactly right, JT. Like it's constant realignment. It is constant, recalibration. But again, looking in the mirror, yeah.
Well, thanks so much, mate. I mean, we've covered so much here, and I'm sure we could continue to talk for ages, but one quick question I've got you. Who, as you were growing up and as you were evolving through your life, who was a man that you actually looked up to, who you sort of maybe, got some great lessons from or modeled yourself on?
Oh, goodness. Look, I think there's a number. Like when I was in Scouts, there was, the scout leader who, I admired greatly. Dave Dyle was his name. And, but then, in the Navy, I actually, one of the PTs, like one of the person, the phys ed, trainers, I admired greatly, and different people at different
What was
points in
his
my
name?
life. I knew you were going to ask me that. Able Seaman. I can't remember.
That's
But
all right. I just
I
asked the
can picture
question
him, right?
because in the early 80s, I
Yes.
used to go to Cerberus and train all the Navy PTIs, you know.
Right. Yeah, I'll think of that and I'll come back to you on that. Sorry. But
No,
what I
you're right.
was going to say, I chatted with a gentleman yesterday that you know. His name's Nigel Champion.
Oh yeah.
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 And Nigel has long held a high degree of esteem in my books, and I've always looked to him as sort of a litmus test for just a good human being, but someone who's managed to navigate the world of business and maintain integrity. And just Nigel is just, for me, I chatted with him yesterday because I really wanted to do a gut check. And I've been doing a lot more of that lately, just phone a friend, right?
Yeah.
And talk to them, talk through stuff. And I think as you hopefully get wiser and get your rough edges cut off, you start to listen more and get data points and seek counsel. And I reached out to Nigel yesterday, and the half hour we had, which was not long enough, was hugely valuable. And we're going to catch up again next week.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Nigel, just a deeply decent human being, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, mate, I always like to look at what's happening in sport, and I received an email a bit over a week ago that said that Ferrari's Formula One driver Carlos Sainz, when he came to Melbourne for the Grand Prix, was struggling with some health issues, and his team tracked down the National Institute of Integrative Medicine, which was founded by Professor Avni Saleh, and he attended the institute, had some hyperbaric oxygen therapy, was able to move through his challenges, and I'm not sure what they were, and he ended up being the winner of the Melbourne Grand Prix. So all power to the team there at the National Institute of Integrative Medicine and the impact they're having on sport. A thought for the week, something I picked up during the week, which I really love, that says, one of the most underrated ingredients for having a good life is a clear conscience. To know you aren't out there doing people wrong and hiding who you are lets you sleep peacefully at night. Karma is real. Energy is contagious. So, Grant, what's next for you?
Mate, I would say I've got a lot on, and the AI system, it's sort of picking up speed, and but my goal ultimately is to build a wellness community that touches a lot of lives and is a template for future communities. And so everything I'm doing sort of is a plug and play for that. And so it would take another 10 minutes to go through the stuff I'm, sort of dabbling with right now, but it's all wellness oriented. So just more of that, and just got to join your initiative, the Workplace Wellbeing Initiative, which I'm loving. And so fingering a lot of pies, but they're all wellness related, I have to say.
Fantastic. So no pork pies, right? Well, mate, it's been so cool having you on. I've loved the discussion. We've gone way over time, but I really don't mind because I think there's a lot of really rich content there, and hopefully our listeners will get a lot out of it. And if you're out there and you're enjoying this podcast, please share it around with your community, and let's sort of help more men out there, especially young men, sort of really step up and develop this greater healthy masculinity, and I really feel like that's going to be a key factor in helping our whole communities move forward. So, as I state at the end of each of these podcasts, be the man that you needed when you were a kid in trouble or you were feeling lost. So, thanks, Grant. Look forward to catching up with you soon, and thank you everybody for tuning in.
Thanks, mate.